Hi everyone, welcome. It's time to introduce our very first speaker, Stacy Cashmore. We are very thrilled to have her with us today. And Stacy calls herself a tech explorer DevOps, and she currently works for OmniPlan here in the Netherlands. She has been rewarded with a Microsoft MVP award last year, and she's been speaking at conferences and meetups since 2018. So, Stacy, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here.
All right, so you're going to talk today about Blazor and static web apps, static websites. I'm actually looking forward to this one because I personally haven't done anything with both Blazor and these static websites on Azure. So I'm really looking forward to it. Stacy, the floor is yours.
Cool, thank you very much. So thank you very much for that introduction there, Irvin. And well, hello to everybody watching. It's really fantastic to be here today and getting to give this talk for the first time. So I wish you luck. With the introduction of Blazor, we had the ability as .NET developers to write our single page applications in the same technology that we write our backend applications. If you're using server-side Blazor, it can even run alongside it. But of course, we also have that wonderful WASM, that client-side Blazor, the ability to run your apps inside the browser. Now, I know a lot of people get scared at this point and think, Silverlight 2.0, but it's not. It's using web standard technologies, and as long as you're using a modern browser, IE, it runs out of the box for you. And so what happens on your first call to the site, you get a WASM compiled .NET runtime downloaded to your client along with your code, and everything runs inside your browser. And because everything runs inside your browser, we no longer need that full-blown big web server in order to serve our site. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We are going to be making a very simple client-side Blazor application with an Azure Function API attached to it. And then we're going to be deploying that into Azure without using an app service or a web app, and looking at some of the things that we can do with this. Now, there are other ways of doing this, of course. You could deploy your Blazor code to an Nginx container and run that inside of Azure. You could deploy your code to an Azure storage account and set that up as a static web app. But the one that's really cool and I really enjoy playing with, it's the static web apps that are currently in preview inside of Azure. Hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. As was said by Aaron, I've been developing software since the mid-1990s. I've been playing with Blazor for the last couple of months. And as Irvin said, I'm really honored to say that last year I was awarded a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. Now, when we are deploying a static web app, I just want to quickly mention some of the advantages, some of the disadvantages, and some of the things that we need to think about whilst we're doing this. Now, the first advantage, it's a big, huge one. We have no overhead. We have no service to maintain. Now, obviously, there's always one server in serverless, but the fun thing is we don't care about it. If you use the static web app approach, you also allow the hosting of both your client application and an API to get dynamic content into your website, all inside of one Azure resource. And as well as the Azure side, which is phenomenal enough, we also get a really wonderful workflow set up for us to allow us to do continuous deployment and even allow us to check that what we built works in a production-like environment before we deploy it to production without us having to do any extra work. Of course, anything that has advantages also has disadvantages. The first one is that wonderful word, preview. Azure static web apps, they're not in general availability yet, which means I really wouldn't recommend running a production workload using them, but you should certainly play with them and see what you can do. The other one is GitHub Actions only, I'm afraid. Azure needs to set up this GitHub GitHub action workflow for you, and your code needs to be available inside of GitHub. If your code is tied to Azure DevOps, I'm really sorry, this isn't the technology for you today. And finally, before we get into the fun stuff, there's just two things that I want to mention to think about before you start playing with these things. And that is, when you use an Azure Static Web App, the GitHub workflow that's set up for you uses a special task which compiles and deploys your code. I agree with Scott Hanselman. I really wish I could see the metal one layer below the magic that I'm using, and I can't do that here. And also, I've heard some people complain when you set up your static web app, you need to authorize your Azure account to access your GitHub repo in order to set up that pipeline. Personally, I don't have an issue with this, but I know a few people that are against giving that permission in principle. And so again, for those people, it's not the technology for them today. Right, that's enough of me just talking. Let's get on to the fun stuff. Let's create our application and see how we can get it into Azure. Now, hopefully you can all see my screen now. I have a nice empty Visual Studio, and that's what we're going to be using to create our application. Now, the solution that we're going to make is going to have two projects inside of it. It's going to have a client project and an API project. Let's quickly make those now. We're going to create a new project. That project, if my computer does something, is going to be a Blazor app, of course. We're going to call it client. The reason for that will become apparent soon. I want it in my GitHub repos, and just so that the right repo gets picked up, I want to call my solution Blazor Talk Demo. That's not important for static web apps, that's just important for me. So let's create this project. We're going to be using a Blazor WebAssembly project. We're going to leave the options on the side completely untouched here. Obviously, we don't want this to be ASP core hosted because we just want to run the application itself. And since as my demo does nothing with progressive web applications, I'm leaving that blank for now. So let's get this created and let it scaffold up. And of course, computers always go really slow anytime you're giving a demonstration. Almost. So now we have our client application. Let's try and add an API to it. So we need to go to the solution. We need to add a new project. This one is going to be an Azure function. We're going to be calling that API. Again, I'll get to why in a minute. We'll create this. And of course, what we want is a HTTP trigger so that we can access it from the client app. This one generally creates nice and quickly. Says she, hopefully. So now we have our client and we have our API, but I also want to show you how you can use this locally as well as inside of Azure. So there's one last thing we need to do before we get into the code, and that is we need to ensure that both of our projects start up when we hit F5, and we just do that inside the solution properties, and we just set both of these to start. Now, what we have at the moment is two scaffolded applications. And because I don't really want to talk too much about Blazor today, but more about deploying this into Azure and the workflow associated with it, I'm going to be using this scaffolded web app. Now, anybody who's played with it before will know that you've got a page called Fetch Data. And this just shows a list of weather forecasts for the coming days. And it gets the data down here from line 42. And it simply does a HTTP get from a JSON file. I don't want to get that from a JSON file. I want to get that from my function. So I've got some code that I'm going to copy over here. And I'm copying the code because you really don't want to watch me mistype words for the next half an hour. We're going to come into our API. We're going to replace the function with a class, which I'll go through in a second. And just because I really hate having classes and files with different names, I'm going to rename this to weather forecast. Now this file, it's really simple. It just returns an array of those weather readings in the same format as the JSON file has. In fact, literally, I copied this data from it. Now we need to use this data inside the client app. And for that, we're going to go back to our fetch data, and we're going to change this line 42. And we're going to say to it, we don't want to get our data from the JSON file anymore. Nope. We want to get our data from an API, the weather forecast. I could deploy this to Azure now, and it would work. But working locally would be a real nightmare for us. And there's a reason for that. You may notice that when we get this from JSON, we access this API path. And that is set up for you inside that atomic Azure resource, the static web app. And it proxies the traffic to your function so that it always behaves like it's on the same URL. So when we run this locally, we need to do two things. One, we need to tell your client app to access your API on a different port number because they're both going to be running together. And secondly, because we're going to be deploying it or running it from a different port number, we have that wonderful word CORS, the cross-origin requests. So we need to make sure when we run locally, our API accepts cross-origin requests into the application. First of all, let's make sure we can get the data from the correct place. For that, we need to create a JSON file inside of our client app. And that needs to go in the www root. These are the files that are deployed when you publish. And we want a new item, and that needs to be a JSON file. We just want a standard JSON file. We're going to replace the contents anyway. And we're going to call that appsettings.development.json, as in these are the settings we want to run in our development environment. And we just have one setting that we want to bring across for this demonstration, and that is API prefix, telling our application to get the API from localhost 7071. Right now, it doesn't do that much so, because this is never used in our app. So we need to make one more change, and that's inside our program.cs. On line 20, we have the HTTP client added to the services with the base address by default of the host environment base address. Again, this works fantastically in production, not so much for locally. So we're going to change this line as well. And what we're going to do, if I can find my mouse, is just add this bit of code here. So we're going to say, look in the configuration, see if I've got this property, API prefix. If I do, awesome, use it. If I don't, never mind. We're going to fall back on the original host environment. So now I can run this locally and point to a different path than in production. I still can't do the CORS yet, so let's fix that one too. To fix the CORS problem, we need to change, again, if I can find my mouse, we need to change our API. And for that, we're going to create a new file inside of properties. And that one is also going to be a JSON file. And we're going to call that one launch settings. And this is going to tell Visual Studio how to run our app when we're debugging. I've got a little JSON object that I need to bring over here as well. And this is just telling it when it starts locally, run our function with CORS and allow anything. Allows us to talk from our client to our API, but doesn't do anything for our production, so it keeps us safe. Now, hopefully, if I press start now, it's going to download the packages. My machine's not going to get stuck and slow down. It's going to start up the Azure storage emulator so that the function can run. And any second now, it's going to give me a browser that I can pull to my screen and show you. Here we go. Now, I want to show you the traffic coming across here. Let's go to our network tab. We're loading application. Here's all of the files that get we can run our app locally, we can debug our app locally, and we can hopefully build something awesome to send up to the cloud. Let's do that now. So we'll stop the application. We will push these changes up to my GitHub repo, add app, commit all and push. We'll just make sure that Visual Studio does actually push it, because very rarely it doesn't. And now we can go and have a look what's inside that repo. So here is my, wow, that's big. Let me lower this down a bit for you. Here is my GitHub repo. If we refresh this page, then hopefully we have our API and our client ready to be pushed up to Azure. For that, we need to start inside of the Azure portal. This is where you first add your static web app. I have a resource group already set up for this. Let's go to the actual resource group, set up for this talk, and we're going to add a new resource here. So we'll click on the add button. We're going to search for static web app in preview, and we're going to create one. As always, check the subscription, and the resource group is what we actually want it to be. It's been created from inside a resource group, so it should be defaulted correctly, but checking's never a bad thing. Give it a name. Demo static Blazor sounds good. I'm in the Netherlands, so I'm going to be running this in West Europe, and then we need to sign in with GitHub. This is a bit that I was talking about. I know people really hate this. I don't, so I'm going to authorize this. There is one important thing to know when you're authorizing your GitHub repo for this. Every time I add one, I have to reauthorize. So it's not like I'm giving Azure carte blanche to do what it wants inside my system. I'm telling it to just create this workflow for me. Now I have access. I need to pick my organization. I need to pick my repository. And I need to pick the branch that I'm working on, which is just main. The next thing we need to do is tell the workflow what it is going to be building. And there's a lot of presets here that we can use. You can build Angular, React, Svelte, Vue. Obviously, we're going to be doing Blazor today. And you can even do custom workflows and sort things out for yourself. That's not something I've played with yet. So why don't we just keep it simple and go with the Blazor workflow? For this, we need 3 pieces of information. We need to know our app location. We need to know our API location, and we need to know an output location. Now, the only one that's mandatory is the app location. So you can deploy something that doesn't talk to an API if you want to. And it pre-fills it with this client, API, and WW root, which is why I went for the client and API in my project. It just makes life simpler. Obviously, you can edit this if you want to, but this just lets it run out of the box. The www root doesn't exist in my repo, and that's important. You can put this to where you want, I believe, but if it exists already in your repo, it's going to crash when it tries to build. So let's review and create this. And then we click create. And hopefully this is going to spin up nice and quickly so I can show you the web app. Yeah, there we go. We have our resource. We can go to it. And we have this URL existing that we can go to, this Jolly Desert. I love these names. You have Jolly Deserts, you have Lemon Deserts, you have Violet Hills. It's whoever came up with this list, I like them. If we click on this, we now go to our static web app and we get a nice message. Your static web app is live and waiting for your content. How do we get that content in there? Well, this is all set up for us. If I refresh my screen again, you'll see we've now got this GitHub workflows. And if we have a look at the workflow file, we can see a simple 2-job workflow in order to get our code deployed. Now, for now, I'm only going to focus on the fact that when we push our main branch, we kick off this build and deploy job. And this uses this magic static web apps deploy, which 0.0.1 preview, like I say, not GA yet. It gets a secret, which is created from the Azure workflow where we created our static web app. You never get to see what this is. Again, I'd love to know what's going on underneath the hub here. We are uploading our website, and we have these 3 settings that we did. our app location to the client, our API location to API, and the output location. So obviously, if you ever change the structure of your solution, you can always come in here and check it as well. Now, hopefully this has been kicked off and it's running. That's good. This takes about 5 minutes to run, and you really don't want to be looking at this running for 5 minutes. So whilst this is going, I want to take a very quick aside, and I would like to talk to you about the workflow that we have inside of static web apps. Now, we've already seen how we can work with this locally by setting up that cause in your development and setting up that API location in your app settings.development. Running locally and running inside of the static web app itself, they are two different things, and we need to treat them as two different things. Thankfully, again, this is all built in out of the box, so we don't need to do anything. So come on, where are you, mouse? Woo-hoo. Awesome, 3 screens, you can lose your mouse really easily. If we go back to our workflow file, we also have not only the push trigger on our main branch, we also have a pull request trigger for opened, synchronized, reopened, and closed. And on anything that isn't closed, we also kick off this build and deploy job using all the same stuff, only there's a really nice piece of magic here. And what it does is check if you're in a pull request, and it makes you a staging environment. Now, like I say, this takes about 5 minutes to deploy, so I don't have a live demo here for you. But for those of you who maybe know a little bit about the UK, in Blue Peter terms, here's what I made earlier. I have a workflow demo repo, and inside of here, I have one pull request. And I've just made a change to one page. I just want to show you the file. I have changed this really boring piece of text, which gives you a useful piece of information. And I've changed that to something which I think is more fun, but not necessarily as much use. Oh, the weather outside is frightful. Guess if it was snowing when I wrote this demo or not. Now, when we kick off a pull request, we get this message from the GitHub Actions bot. We have a stage site ready for us, and it's at a URL. And if we, come on, if we click on this and open it, we get a copy of our website. We can go to the page that we've changed, this fetch data, and we can see, oh, the weather outside is frightful, which is kind of ironic because it's beautiful sunshine where I am right now. Just to show you that this really is a copy of my production site for this demo, if I remove this -1.West Europe and I go to this site, here is my production version of this repo. And in our fetch data, we still have this useful but boring text. This component demonstrates fetching data from the server. So this is great. We have a way of checking our code inside of a production-like environment, and we can run end-to-end tests on here. We can make sure it does what we want it to do, and we don't have to do anything for it. But what happens when you approve the pull request? You really don't want lots of these sites staying in the air with lots of old things available. Well, thankfully, again, let's have a look at our workflow file. We have this second job. When we have a pull request, which we close, we perform exactly the same task, this static web apps deploy, only we call it with the action of close. And this tears down our staging site and cleans up afterwards. And again, this is all out of the box. So that's a little bit about how our workflow works. If we come back and have a look at our demo site, we can see that the pipeline is now finished. It's actually really quick today, 3 minutes. That's 2 minutes less than it generally takes me. And if we come back to this jolly desert and refresh it, we now have our working application. Inside of Azure, if we open our developer tools and take a look at the network tab, If we go to our fetch data, we can see that we're getting our weather forecast from the right place, this API weather forecast route, and it's all working for us. Inside of about, what, 15, 20 minutes, it's deployed, it's ready. It's not ready. There's two things that we still need to change here. The first one is we've just deployed a client-side application to a static web app. That is, we're just serving static files. We're currently on the fetch data screen. If I refresh this screen, it disappears. And it disappears because it doesn't exist on the server. Now, when I first started looking at this, I set up all sorts of complex Azure function proxies to handle this for me. And I got it working, and I was kind of quite proud of it. And it was completely pointless because there's a much easier way of doing this. Let's do that now. Let's change our code to handle deep linking and letting users refresh inside of routes. So we're going to go back to our code. And we're going to add one last file, which of course is going to be another JSON file. And that one's going to be, again, inside of our WW root. So this is published when we publish our site. It's going to be a JSON file again, and routes.json. Now, this is a really important file when you're working with Blazor. So I'd recommend following the courses on MS Learn and seeing what's available to you. We're not going to use it fully here. We're going to cheat. We're going to have one route defined, and that says if you can't find what it's looking for, redirect to index.html with the status code 200. Otherwise, you get a 404 not found, even though you see things on your screen. And then when it's redirected, the client app takes care of where it came from, figures out there's a route associated with it, and sends you to it. I can't demonstrate this locally, and I really wish I could. But Visual Studio takes care of all of this for you when you run it locally, which means you can think it works perfectly right up until the point when you go to production and then nothing works. So let's upload this. And then we can see it working in production. So we need to pull. We need to pull first because obviously we have that workflow added to our branch. And now we should be able to push. And everything goes up. So let's go back to our site. Let's just check that our action has been kicked off again. Yep, we now have this continuous integration, continuous deployment workflow working out of the blocks. But again, it's going to take about 3 minutes to run. So while this is running, I want to deal with the last problem that we have in our website. And that last problem, if we go back to our main site, is the fact that this URL, whilst I love it, jolly does it, it's also an Azure Static Apps URL. You're not going to want to give this to your users, and no one's going to remember -063B9103. We want to make something memorable. We want to use a custom domain. And this is going to be the last step in our flow today. How do we do that? Well, inside of our resource groups, let's go back into our demo resource group. And inside of this PR flow, I'm going to add a custom domain. Now, I'm going to run through this first really quickly, and then I'm going to go through it step by step in our demo flow to show you what happens. So we want to add a custom domain, and we're going to add it to www.stacyclouds.com. We're going to validate this. It works, and now we can add it. I'm so pleased that worked. My DNS provider had a DDoS attack earlier in this week. When I was trying to prep this demo, nothing worked anymore. Now, that takes a few minutes to deploy as well. That's why I wanted to run through it really quickly to start with. But while that's deploying, let's have a look at our new demo static web app, the one that we've just created. We have in the menu custom domains. So obviously, we're going to go there. We have a page where we can add our domains. We're going to add a new one. And you can see that the top line says we need to add a record to our DNS provider's records. And that needs to be a CNAME on the www level, and it needs to point to the URI of our web app. If you don't have this, you can't set up the custom domain. Instead, you'll get different error messages. So let's try www.stacyclouds.dev. I didn't go on a shopping spree for domain names at all. Here you can see that the CNAME record's invalid. Please update it and then do it. And you can also see this takes up to 48 hours to propagate through. So that's another reason why I couldn't do this completely on the fly with you. You've got to set this up a few days in advance to make sure that it works. You might make a mistake. You might point to a domain that already has a CNAME record, and in which case you'll get a different error message. You'll get that the request envelope is invalid. Please ensure the domain name is not linked to another site. Assuming you've done everything right and you create your domain name, it will now be listed here. And this page kind of looks like you can do more than one domain name. It's lying to you. Right now, in the preview, we can only do one domain name, and it has to be www. This is a bit of a nightmare because it means that we don't have root domain support to run our static web apps, which means if I go to www.stacyclouds.com, I'm going to see my new website. If I go to stacyclouds.com, I'm going to see a 404 because it doesn't exist. It also means that we can't run our static web apps underneath a subdomain. So I can't have mycoolapp.stacyclouds.com. Now, I know for a lot of people, this is a real showstopper. For a lot of production things, it's an absolute showstopper. Again, you can set up an Azure function as a proxy for you to cope with this. You can set up redirects or proxies at your domain provider if they support it. But it really needs to work out the box, and we can just keep our fingers crossed that when this goes general availability, it's going to be fixed. Now, once that happened, I got a nice pop-up here saying that my custom domain is active. So let's go look at it. www.stacyclouds.com. And let's actually try putting in the right URL because that might help. And here we have my website with the fetch data also now coming from my domain name. It's working for us. But like I say, just to show you what happens, if we go to stacyclouds.com, we get a 404. It doesn't exist. And it's not even just because of that fetch data. It just doesn't exist. You get the fact that it's parked on my DNS provider. So hopefully this is going to be changed. Now, I want to do one last thing before we talk about what we've made today. And that is, I want to check, now that my new site's been deployed, if I go to fetch data and refresh, it now refreshes for us as we expect it to be. That routes.json is doing its work. And we can even now deep link to the counter page and go directly there. Everything's working as we expect it to. So that's the end of the demo for today. I hope that you can appreciate that in a little over half an hour, we have, again, made that static website with an admittedly very simple Azure Function API. We've made it workable locally. We've deployed it to a brand new static web app, shown how to link it up to a custom domain, and even seen how we can get our state sites inside of our pull request. If you want to give this a try yourself, I'd recommend looking at the MS Learn, and on my Twitter feed, hopefully if scheduled tweets have done their thing, you should see a link to that already. And I'd recommend looking at MS Learn anyway, to be honest. There are so many amazing resources there, and as developers, we should be taking advantage of it. Thanks again for taking your time to listen to me. Thanks again to 4Dotnet for giving me the chance to give this talk. I hope you enjoyed this session. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Stacy.
The thing that I nearly forgot. If you want, there's a QR code which you can use to get to the MS Learn as well.
Thanks. Then people can actually use that to go there and try it out for themselves. Thanks for the awesome talk, Stacy. I definitely learned a few things that I didn't know about yet. If I'm correct, this was actually the first time you delivered this new talk, right?
Yes.
Well done. And the demo codes were actually good for you today. All your demos nicely worked out.
Yeah, so
That's great.
I did the right things to the demo gods. I've been told before, if your rehearsals go badly, you're good for the day. My rehearsals this week, especially with that DDoS attack on my DNS provider, they were petrifying. So apparently I had the petrifying at the right time.
Right. Yeah, went great. All right, so we have a few questions for you, both from the YouTube chat and also a few from Twitter. So let's start with those. One of the things I personally was interested in is when will this be general available? Do you have any dates on that?
That I wish I knew. I've tried to find out, and the only thing that I've really found out is Microsoft don't like telling you when they're going to take things off of general availability. Which is when they're going to make things general availability, I should say, when they're going to take things out of preview. And I'm going to carry on looking, and if I find it, I will put it in my Twitter feed. But so far, I honestly can't tell you. It's been there for a while, so I'm hoping it's not going to be that much longer, because I think it's been in preview now for, 6 months or more? So yeah, it's fingers crossed they do it soon, but I say also fingers crossed they fix the custom domains issue first.
Yeah, I can imagine that's really a hard one to get around. Yeah. So do you have any idea actually when will there be support in Azure DevOps to have the same deployment workflow as you showed us in GitHub?
You know what? I don't know if it's true or not, but my experience the last year is that Azure DevOps pipelines, they're starting to become a little bit the unwanted child. It's I hope that that's going to change, but since GitHub's become available, I've noticed that a lot of the new cool stuff seems to go more to GitHub, and there's not that many updates that I've seen for the Azure DevOps pipelines themselves. I hope it's going to come across, but yeah, we have to wait and see. Right.
I actually noticed the same thing you point out there. So we probably have to switch sometime to GitHub.
I imagine at some point that's what they're going to say, and they're just going to make the integration better.
Yeah.
I have no insight into this. This is a pure guess from my side, but it's the cynic inside of me is looking that way.
Yeah. I mean, it also makes sense, right? If you look at it from a Microsoft perspective, then it doesn't really make sense to have two of these platforms out there that could
and they're quite different.
do the same thing. Yeah. All right, so we have another question actually, which is about the staging slots that are also available when you use these static websites. Is there any way to hide them from being publicly available?
That is one thing that I've not played with yet. It's there's two issues with the fact that it is just available to the outside world. And that is, even if you use a custom domain, obviously your other domain is also still available to the outside world. There's not a way inside the static web app itself to stop it from being displayed to the outside world, I don't think. You can I don't know if you can put it inside of a subnet and use that. It's something I want to play with, and hopefully I can get an answer in the coming weeks, and I'll blog about it if I do. It's something which has been on my mind as well. It's kind of the same as the static web apps via the storage. That's also always available publicly. So it's a bit of a different thing than actually setting up your own website. It is the easy route, and with the easy route, I think there's a few disadvantages that come with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it is available if you just use the older Azure web app, so to say. So it is there, so it might make sense for them to also move that to the static websites as well. Although it's probably different tech underneath this part. All right, so I also gonna share the repo and the source code, and we especially got a question around the pipelines that you used. If you're also gonna share those definitions with the audience today.
Sorry?
Are you going to share the code you showed today and the YAML files that you use?
I can share that code. What I would do is it won't be this repo, because I kill this repo every time I do the demo. But I will turn this into a proper repo, and I will let people look at it. Obviously, there's limitations here because of that secret. So you can't just take my code and do it. But I'll share something that hopefully gives people a chance to get started. Maybe share the demo without the pipeline associated with it, and just the instructions, a small tutorial on how to get it working.
All right, that will work. That will definitely work. All right, so anyway, did we have any additional questions coming in on our Twitter feed?
No, I didn't see any other questions except for this one, asking whether or not Stacy could share this repo, but that one is already answered. So I guess we're going to wait until Henry. Oh no, we're not. I'm actually skipping something. Stacy, do you have a question to the audience?
I have a question for the audience. Yeah, it's what would the relative path be that you need to use in order to reach the Azure function in an Azure static web app?
All right, that's a good question. So if you know the answer to this question, then please tweet your answer with the hashtag 4Dotnet Conf, and also make sure that you follow the 4Dotnet account. That makes you eligible. Is that a word in English? I don't know how to pronounce that.
Eligible.
Yeah, exactly, that one. So all the correct answers, we will throw them in a pool and we will draw prizes between the winners. So once again, Stacy, thank you very much for joining. I think it's really brave of you to, for the first time, do such a talk with a lot of demos, a lot of coding, a lot of dependencies on the Azure cloud, and it went so well.
Thank you so much. It was awesome to give the talk. Thanks for giving me the chance to try it out, and thanks for thinking of me when you needed somebody to step in this week. It is much appreciated.
Yep, thank you. And once again, thank you for joining.